In April 2024, 19-year-old Emma Caldwell headed out alone for a waterfall hike in the Great Smoky Mountains and simply never came back. Rangers chalked it up to a runaway. People in town muttered about suicide. For half a year, the little river kept its mouth shut until a pair of hikers spotted something on the bank that didn't match any of the official theories. Emma's clothes folded dry, laid out like an offering on a flat rock, untouched by the water that should have ruined every thread. And what led up to that moment would drag a sleepy mountain community into a dark, tangled investigation that rattled the entire state. On the morning of April 17, 2024, just after 8 o'clock, Emma's aging Honda Civic rolled into the small parking lot at the Laurel Falls trailhead. Low clouds sat heavy over the Smokies, a grey veil clinging to the ridgelines. Emma killed the engine, grabbed a light backpack, slung it over one shoulder, popped in her earbuds and walked straight for the trail without so much as a hello to anyone. A ranger posted near the entrance later remembered a quick nod from her. Nothing more. No tears, no visible panic, nobody walking beside her. Just a teenage girl heading up a trail she'd never hiked before. She never came back down. By that evening, the car still sat where she'd left it, unlocked, wallet on the passenger seat, keys tossed in the cup holder. Nobody flagged it at first. Emma was known for being independent, the kind of kid who'd disappear for a day to go hiking or take an impulsive solo drive. She'd once taken off for a whole weekend without telling anyone, her brother Daniel later admitted. But when park staff came in the next morning and saw the same faded Civic in the same exact spot, their attitude shifted. They ran the plates, checked the registration, and called the Caldwell family. By midday, a search was underway. Dogs were brought in. Rangers combed cabins, overlooks, maintenance roads. Helicopters skimmed the tree line, thermal cameras scanning the dense canopy below. Nothing. Not a boot print beyond the first mile marker, no sign of a slide or a fall, no discarded water bottle or broken phone. It was like Emma had walked into the forest and simply stepped out of the world. At first, her disappearance barely drew media interest. Missing person cases in the Smokies weren't unheard of. Around town, rumors filled the vacuum. Some said she'd run off with a boyfriend. Others claimed she'd been depressed and finally acted on it. Off the record, one ranger suggested she might have just decided to disappear from her life. Her family refused to accept that, Daniel especially. That wasn't her, he told a reporter 2 weeks into the search. She texted me every night. Even if we were fighting, she'd still send something. Every night. As spring turned to summer, the formal search effort wound down. By July, the official operation was quietly closed. On paper, Emma Caldwell was now a voluntarily missing adult. In hushed conversations, the sheriff told Daniel it was time to let go. Daniel didn't. Then October changed everything. 6 months after Emma vanished, 2 hikers followed a deer trail down to a narrow bend in the Little River, about 10 miles downstream from the Laurel Falls Trail. They were about to turn back when they saw a small stack of clothing on a flat rock by the water. The clothes were folded, dry, clean. They spotted a name written on the inside of a jacket tag, Emma Caldwell. When Daniel heard, he drove back that night. He met Sheriff Clay Harmon in person, hoping this would finally force the department to treat the case like something more than a runaway. Instead, he got a shrug. The sheriff's theory was simple. The clothes had probably washed downstream. Someone found them and laid them out on the rock. Stuff like that happens, Harmon said. When Daniel asked if they were testing for DNA, fingerprints, anything, Harmon's answer was half-hearted. They'd send it all to the lab, he said, but Daniel shouldn't read too much into it. That was the moment Daniel's unease sharpened into something else. He'd seen the photos. The jacket wasn't swollen or stained like it had been soaked. The fabric wasn't heavy with river water or torn from catching on rocks. The jeans still held shape, creases intact. They didn't look like something that had been dragged along a riverbed. They looked placed, deliberate, and right on top the one thing Emma almost never took off, her bracelet. 2 days later, Daniel stood at that same river bend, staring at the empty rock and the damp impressions where the clothes had been before deputies boxed everything up. Standard procedure, they told him. But he'd already gotten close enough. The jacket had been bone dry. The jeans still carried the faint sweetness of Emma's vanilla body spray. And the bracelet. He'd picked it up in front of them before they could stop him. A thin strip of leather with a metal clasp, their initials E&D scratched into it. The engraving was clear, not eaten away by rust or water. "You need to set that down, son," a deputy called out. Daniel didn't respond right away. He ran his thumb over the letters, noting every nick and dent. Finally, he placed it back on the pile as gently as he could. None of it added up. The next morning, Daniel walked into the sheriff's office with a different demeanor. He wasn't there to beg for help. He was there to demand answers. Sheriff Clay Harmon met him in the lobby, the same soft-spoken man who'd been wearing the badge in that county for years. "Daniel," Harmon said, "this is hard. That river plays tricks on folks. Sometimes it gives back things you never expect to see again." Daniel shook his head. "Those clothes weren't washed up, Clay. They were folded." Harmon exhaled through his nose, eyes dropping for a second. "Maybe some hiker pulled them out downstream, brought them back up here, tried to be helpful." "Who does that?" Daniel snapped. "Who drags someone's clothes back upstream and folds them like laundry?" Harmon held his stare, then rolled one shoulder in a small shrug. "We're running prints. That's all I can say." Daniel could tell Harmon didn't fully believe his own explanation. It was there in the sheriff's eyes, something tight and uneasy, something that looked a lot like fear. Not fear of Daniel, fear of where this might lead. That night, Daniel sat alone going through a year's worth of Emma's messages. Late-night memes, complaints about classes, photos of coffee cups, her worn hiking boots, a squirrel she'd found on campus. Buried in the scroll, he found a text he'd brushed aside at the time, sent 2 weeks before she vanished. "Some creep keeps talking to me on the trail. Probably nothing, just annoying." He'd replied with nothing more than a laughing emoji. Now that tiny reaction felt like a betrayal. The next day by noon, Daniel was on the Laurel Falls Trail himself. The forest pressed in close, the river whispering below. Other hikers passed him, couples, photographers, solo walkers with cameras bouncing on their chests. Nobody gave him a second glance. Daniel watched everybody, every face, every person who lingered near the trail edge a little too long. At about half a mile in, he spotted something strapped to a tree, a trail camera. Not park property, one of those commercial models hunters buy. Its indicator light blinked, active. Daniel followed the direction of its lens. It was angled perfectly to catch anyone stepping onto the trail. He looked for a label and found a sticker on the side, Hunter Haven, Knoxville. By the next morning, he was standing under the fluorescent lights of Hunter Haven's showroom. He asked about that particular camera model. The clerk couldn't tell him who bought that exact unit, but he did remember a frequent customer. "We sell a bunch of these to a guy named Dean Fraser," the clerk said. "Says he runs tracking tours near Laurel Falls." Daniel frowned. "Who is he?" The clerk shrugged. "Some hiker. Takes people out on private tours. Gives off a weird vibe, if you ask me." Daniel walked out of the store with his stomach tight. He'd never heard Emma mention anyone named Dean, not once. But there was no way that name and that trail cam were just coincidence. Within 48 hours, the internet provided the next piece. A local hunter posted a compilation of trail cam clips, bragging about deer patterns near the falls. Buried in the grainy footage was Emma, captured walking alone. 15 seconds later, a man followed along the same path, dark jacket, baseball cap, hands deep in his pockets. For half a heartbeat, he glanced toward the camera. The hunter tagged him in the caption, "Think that's Dean." Daniel watched the clip over and over. Emma appeared first, hoodie on, backpack tight on her shoulders, earbuds in. Then the man, average build, cap pulled low, no pack, no water, nothing that suggested a real day hike. Just those empty hands and his eyes fixed on her back. Daniel grabbed a screenshot and sent it straight to Sheriff Harmon. The reply was exactly what he'd come to expect. "We've seen it." Not enough to act on. The following morning, Daniel was parked down the road from a small, rusting, single-wide trailer, half hidden by trees. According to county records, it was where Dean Fraser lived. No name on the mailbox, no welcome mat. A beat-up SUV sat out front, a faded hiking tour decal peeling from the rear window. Daniel didn't knock. He circled the property slowly, keeping low, keeping his distance. On his third loop, he saw it, a plastic crate wedged under the porch. Inside, boots, gloves, coils of rope, and on top a folded flyer. Private Falls Tours with Dean Fraser. A phone number, email, no official logo, no registered business details. Daniel took a photo of the flyer and left. That night, he found himself drawn back to the river bend where Emma's clothes had appeared. The air was colder now, the water darker under the autumn sky. He crouched near the same flat rock, scanning the mud and stones. That's when a glimmer caught his eye, a sliver of metal half buried under a wet leaf. He brushed the leaf aside and picked it up. A SIM card. Not cracked, not corroded. It looked like it had been there for days, not months. By the next morning, Daniel was in the back of a small tech shop in Knoxville, watching a technician load the SIM into a reader. A few seconds later, the screen filled with data, 5 text messages, all from the same number. Daniel read the first one aloud. "Don't think I don't see you. I know where you go." The second, "I'll be there next time you're alone." His throat tightened. The third was worse. "Pretty girls shouldn't walk alone." He didn't read the last 2 out loud. When he asked if there was a way to trace the number, the tech shook his head. Without carrier cooperation, no. But he could tell Daniel one thing. The SIM belonged to a cheap prepaid burner. Bought cash only. Daniel wasn't surprised. By sundown, he was back outside Dean's trailer. This time he hung back, parked a short distance away where he could watch the front door. An hour later, Dean emerged in hiking boots, same beat-up ball cap, a duffel over his shoulder. He walked to the SUV, paused and turned. His eyes met Daniel's across the distance. For a split second, neither moved. Then Dean's mouth curled into a slow, crooked smile before he climbed in and drove off. Daniel didn't tail him. He didn't need to. That smile said enough. Dean knew he was being watched and liked it. For the next 2 days, Daniel ran surveillance. He tracked Dean's routines: early runs, midday errands, late-night drives out toward the mountains. Dean never seemed rushed and never looked over his shoulder long enough to suggest real paranoia. It was like a man who understood that the people meant to stop him had no interest in doing it. On the 3rd night, Dean's SUV pulled away from the trailer around 8:30 p.m., taillights disappearing down the dark county road, apparently heading for another night hike. Daniel moved. He slipped onto the property, crossed the yard, and tested the front door. Locked. Around back, a cracked window sat above a rusted air conditioner. A few minutes with a screwdriver, and the frame gave way with a dull pop. Inside, the place smelled of stale coffee and damp carpet. Daniel listened for a long, still moment. Silence. The living room looked unremarkable at first glance. Sagging couch, TV balanced on a crate, stacks of old magazines. Then he saw the walls. They were crowded with unframed photographs, each pinned up with thumbtacks. Faces of hikers, almost all women, caught in candid moments. Adjusting a strap, tying a boot, leaning over a map. Daniel's stomach turned as he scanned the rows. Halfway along, he froze. Emma, caught mid-step on a trail, her head turned slightly, the ghost of a smile on her lips. A moment she never knew someone had captured, displayed at perfect eye level. Fight or flight roared through Daniel's chest. Instead of tearing the photo down, he forced himself to keep going, to look for something that would matter in a courtroom. On the coffee table, in a small box, he found scraps of paper with blocky handwriting. Notes. Emma likes the falls. Alone 4 to 10, green backpack hiker. Follow next time. Nobody looks twice if you smile. Daniel took photos of every scrap, every wall. In a corner, half hidden by a shadow, he spotted a small trunk secured with an old padlock. He dragged it into the light and pried the lock open with his makeshift tool. Inside lay a folded hoodie he recognized immediately, Emma's, and beneath it a necklace he knew even better. Her delicate pendant on a chain, the one he'd given her for her birthday. She'd worn it constantly. Daniel held it, feeling the weight of it in his palm. He snapped another photo of the trunk and its contents, and that's when he heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps outside the window. The front door handle jiggled. Daniel didn't think. He bolted back to the open window, slid through, dropped to the ground, and sprinted toward the dark tree line. As he ran, he heard the front door open and a voice call out into the night, low and almost amused. "See you soon, Danny." He didn't stop running. He didn't sleep that night either. Instead, he sat in his truck parked on a gravel turnout, Emma's necklace wrapped tight in his fist, every inch of him vibrating with the urge to go back and end it with his bare hands. But he knew how that would go. Dean wasn't some unknown drifter. He was entangled in the fabric of that town. He had drinking buddies, hunting buddies, maybe even friends in law enforcement. Men like Sheriff Harmon didn't ignore that kind of connection for free. At sunrise, Daniel drove back into town straight to the sheriff's office. He waited outside until Harmon arrived in his cruiser. The moment the sheriff stepped out, Daniel met him at the door, phone in one hand, Emma's necklace in the other. "Your buddy Dean is a predator," Daniel said, voice tight, "and I can prove it." Harmon didn't look shocked, didn't get defensive. He just looked tired. Inside the office, Daniel laid everything out. The trail cam stills, the texts from the sim, the photos from Dean's walls, the notes, the trunk, and finally the necklace on the desk between them. Harmon stared at the pile in silence, his jaw working. "You know what this looks like?" he finally asked. Daniel's fist clenched. "It looks like you've let a predator walk around your town for 6 months. Harmon's eyes snapped up. "It also looks like you broke into his home, tampered with potential evidence, and trespassed. You want to explain to the press why you didn't go into that house yourself?" Daniel shot back. They stared each other down. Then Harmon sagged back in his chair, the fight draining from his shoulders. "I'll take this to the DA, he said quietly. "But you're done. Stay out of it. That's your only warning." Daniel stood. "I've been out of it long enough." By that evening, the sheriff's quiet warnings got louder. A deputy, who also happened to be Harmon's nephew, tracked Daniel down at his motel with a message. If he didn't back off, they'd find charges to hang on him instead. Daniel told him to relay a message of his own. "Tell your uncle I'm not scared of him." The next morning, he woke up to find all 4 tires on his truck stabbed open. No note, no explanation. But there didn't need to be. In a town that small, silence was its own language. The motel clerk confirmed it an hour later with a nervous apology. "Sheriff says if you don't move on, they'll impound your truck. I can't have that kind of trouble here." Daniel understood. The town had made its choice. That afternoon, he walked on foot to the sheriff's office. He didn't make it past the front desk. Harmon met him there, expression grim. "We pulled Dean in this morning," Harmon said. "He says you've been stalking him. Swears you broke into his home and planted evidence." Daniel crossed his arms. "Let him file whatever he wants. When the truth comes out, we'll see who gets buried first." Harmon leaned in, voice low. "Keep this up and someone's not walking away." Daniel didn't blink. "Good." By the next day, Daniel was packing up his motel room, not because he was giving up, but because he needed to stay mobile. The clerk's warning about his truck being impounded wasn't an idle threat. Still, before he could leave town for good, something shifted. That night, he parked near the same river bend where Emma's clothes had been found. He sat in the dark cab of his truck, turning the necklace over and over in his fingers, the river murmuring somewhere beyond the trees. Out of the darkness behind him, a voice cut through the quiet. "Looking for this?" Daniel turned sharply. Dean stood just beyond the reach of the headlights, casual as if they'd met for a drink. Daniel's muscles tensed. "Get away from me." Dean took a slow step closer and tossed something onto the hood. A phone. Emma's. Daniel's heart slammed. He grabbed it. The cracked case, the stickers, there was no mistaking it. Dean smirked. "She handed that to me herself the night she left." "You're lying," Daniel said. Dean tilted his head. "Am I?" Daniel wanted to lunge across the hood and put him in the ground, but Dean just chuckled. "Careful. You cause a scene and that phone disappears, just like she did." Then he turned his back and walked into the dark, leaving Daniel alone with the device that had belonged to his sister. An hour later, at a truck stop outside town, Daniel plugged Emma's phone into a charger. When it finally powered up, the lock screen demanded a passcode. He tried Emma's birthday, nothing. The family dog's name, still nothing. On a desperate hunch, he entered the date she vanished. The phone unlocked. Almost everything had been wiped. No long text chains, no camera roll full of selfies. Just 2 audio files sitting in a folder. Daniel opened the first. Emma's voice filled his ears, shaky, breath short. "If you're hearing this, I don't know if I made it back. There's a man following me. I don't know his name, but I've seen him before. If I don't come home, tell Daniel I'm sorry." Daniel's grip slipped. The phone nearly fell. He forced himself to open the second file. A man's voice now, calm, Dean. "That's better. See, wasn't so hard. Let's go for a walk." He could hear Emma's breathing, footsteps on gravel, then a sudden muffled cry. The recording ended in silence. Daniel stared at the screen, every nerve in his body screaming. This time he didn't dial the sheriff. This wasn't about case files anymore. This was about making sure Dean never did this again. By the next day, he had a plan. If the town and law enforcement wouldn't bring Dean into the light, Daniel would do it himself. He needed Dean to incriminate himself somewhere he couldn't pretend nobody heard him. Around noon, Daniel slid into a corner booth at Miller's Diner, the busiest place in town on a Sunday. Cooks shouted orders, plates clattered, conversations overlapped. He clipped a small recorder to his shirt, the same kind he'd used in the army, and waited. Right on schedule, around 12:30, Dean stepped through the door and took his usual stool at the counter. He hadn't seen Daniel yet. Daniel tapped the recorder, making sure the light blinked. When Dean finally turned and spotted him, the older man froze, considering, then smirked, grabbed his coffee and walked over. "Well, damn, Danny," Dean said, sliding into the opposite side of the booth. "Didn't know you were that attached." Daniel rested his hands on the table. Figured it was time for an honest conversation. Dean leaned back, stretching out like he owned the place. "You ready to drop this yet? People around here like things quiet." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then you shouldn't have gone after my sister." The smirk twitched at the corner of Dean's mouth, but his eyes hardened. "You still running around saying I killed her?" Daniel leaned forward. "She recorded you. I've got your voice on her phone, telling her what to do. You think anyone's going to buy your harmless tour guide act after they hear that?" Dean's jaw tightened. "You're playing with fire, boy." Around them, the diner sounds dipped, nearby tables growing quieter as people glanced over. Daniel didn't look away. Dean exhaled and, after a beat, spoke through clenched teeth. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I just helped her disappear." The words hung in the air. Daniel felt the room tilt. "You're not the only one who knows how to work a story," Dean continued. "You think they're going to believe you after they see what I've got? Cameras in my house, remember? You broke in, you stole from me, you looked crazy doing it. I got it all on tape." A chill slid down Daniel's spine. Dean tapped the table. "So maybe the grieving brother snapped. Maybe he needed someone to blame." Daniel let a long silence stretch between them, then spoke softly. "This whole time, that recorder's been on." Dean blinked. "Everyone just heard you say you helped her disappear." Dean's face went pale beneath the brim of his cap. Daniel stood up. A few heads turned. He looked down at Dean. "I'll see you soon." Then he walked out, heart pounding, the recorder warm against his chest. He knew the retaliation would come. He just underestimated how quickly. By nightfall, he returned to his motel room to find the door kicked in. Inside, the mattress lay gutted, stuffing everywhere. His backpack had been emptied, papers shredded, the voice recorder gone. On the wall, written in huge black letters, "Walk away." No signature, no attempt to disguise the handwriting. Dean wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was making a point. He didn't fear consequences because he didn't expect any. Daniel spent the rest of the night driving back roads, trying to stay one step ahead of the next move. Eventually, he parked behind an old abandoned ranger station near the southern trailhead, a building the Park Service had stopped using years ago. Busted windows, peeling paint, no neighbors for a long stretch. He killed the engine, sat in the dark, and stared at Emma's phone, the audio file still queued up. Her voice, her terror, now fused with every breath he took. Around 2 in the morning, his burner phone buzzed. "Unknown number," he answered. Dean's voice slid through the speaker. "Should have left when you had the chance, Danny boy." Daniel said nothing. "Don't worry," Dean continued. "They'll find your truck down by the river. Same place they found her clothes." The line went dead. Daniel's heart slammed into his throat. He grabbed his knife and his keys, but before he could move, headlights washed across the broken windows. Tires crunched gravel. An engine idled just outside. Daniel ducked behind the doorway, fingers tight around the pocket knife he'd carried since boot camp. Footsteps hit the porch. Slow, relaxed. "You got guts, I'll give you that," Dean's voice drifted in. Daniel stayed quiet, lungs burning. "You want to hear how it ended?" Dean called. "You want to know what happened to her?" The footsteps drew closer. "Come outside and ask like a man." Daniel barely breathed. He could almost feel Emma's hand on his shoulder, telling him not to take the bait. He stayed hidden. After a long pause, Dean laughed softly. Didn't think so. A door slammed. The SUV rumbled away. Daniel didn't move until the sound faded to nothing. That's when he knew for sure. If this went on much longer, somebody really wasn't going to walk away, and Dean intended that someone to be him. At sunrise, Daniel stopped hiding. He drove back into town and went to the one person who'd seen just enough to know something was wrong. Maya Lewis, 28, a waitress at Miller's who'd been serving coffee 2 booths away during his showdown with Dean. He hadn't planned on dragging her deeper into it, but by now he was out of options. When he slipped into a booth, Maya shot him a wary look. "Don't start anything in here," she muttered. "I just need 5 minutes," he said. She hesitated, then sat across from him on her break. Daniel pulled Emma's phone from his jacket and played the diner recording he'd salvaged on another device, the one capturing Dean admitting he helped her disappear. Maya's eyes widened. She listened in silence. When the audio stopped, she whispered, "You really got that?" Daniel nodded. She stared at the table for a long second, then leaned in. "There's something I didn't tell anyone," she said, voice low. "A while back, Dean was here late, talking to some guy at the counter. They were whispering about a tackle box. He said it had her stuff in it. Said if people started asking questions, he'd just toss it back in the river. Said nobody would find it twice." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Did you report it?" he asked. Maya shook her head. "No, I've got kids." "I'm not getting in the middle of whatever this is," Daniel nodded. "You've already done more than most." He walked out of the diner with a new target in mind. A few hours later, he was back at the river bend, scanning the shoreline like a crime scene tech. The current moved lazily around exposed roots and slick stones. For a long stretch, he found nothing. Then, wedged under a tangle of roots, he spotted the rusted edge of a metal box. A tackle box. The latch had been forced or snapped off. Hands shaking, he dragged it free and flipped the lid. Inside lay a small coil of cable, Emma's missing bracelet, her phone charger, a folded scrap of paper, and tucked beneath, a torn piece of hoodie fabric, stained dark. Daniel stared at the cloth, heart jackhammering. He unfolded the note. One sentence written in rough block letters. She didn't get far. He snapped photos of everything where it sat, every angle, every item. Then he closed the box and made the call he'd been threatening for days. When Harmon answered, Daniel's voice was flat. "I've got physical evidence and a witness. Meet me at the river. If you don't, I'm going to the feds." Harmon didn't argue. An hour later, his cruiser pulled up on the dirt road. He walked down to the bank, eyes flicking from Daniel to the tackle box. Daniel said nothing and just opened the lid. The sheriff looked at the bracelet, the charger, the cloth, the note. The river murmured behind them. "Where'd you find it?" Harmon asked quietly. "Right where Dean said he left it," Daniel replied. Harmon's jaw tightened. He lifted his radio. "Unit 12, locate and detain Dean Fraser. Bring him in, now." Static crackled. Then a deputy's voice came back. "Copy that. Fraser just walked into Miller's diner." Harmon glanced at Daniel. "You're coming with me." 15 minutes later, Daniel stood outside the diner's front windows watching. Sheriff Harmon stepped in first, hand resting near his holster. Dean sat at the counter with a coffee, just like every other day. He turned when the bell over the door chimed and gave a little laugh. "Sheriff, to what do I owe the honor?" Harmon's voice was flat. "On your feet, Dean." Dean's eyes flicked to Daniel outside, then back to Harmon. "What's the charge?" he asked, still half smiling. "Obstruction, tampering with evidence," Harmon said. "We'll figure out the rest downtown." For a heartbeat, Dean didn't move. Then he rose slowly from the stool. Daniel saw the shift before Harmon did, the way Dean's shoulders tensed, the way his right hand slid toward his jacket. A glint of metal flashed. Dean lunged. Harmon reached for his gun, but Dean was already moving, a knife arcing toward him. The shot thundered through the diner. Diners screamed. Plates shattered. Dean collapsed to the tile, knife skittering out of his grasp. Blood spread in a widening pool. Harmon stood over him, gun still aimed, chest heaving. Daniel stepped inside. Dean lay on the floor, the man who'd haunted Emma's last days, who'd stalked Daniel for weeks, suddenly small and mortal. No confession in front of a camera, no judge, no jury. Just a body cooling under fluorescent lights. Outside, word spread fast. People crowded the sidewalk, phones held high, videos were already being recorded, narratives already forming. Daniel barely heard any of it. He kept staring at the man, who had dangled Emma's phone in front of him like a trophy. Eventually, Harmon lowered his weapon. "You got what you came for," the sheriff said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "No, I came to bring Emma home." Harmon had no answer for that. He just nodded once and walked away into the chaos. That night, with sirens fading far behind him, Daniel went back to the river one last time. He carried the tackle box in one hand and Emma's necklace in the other. The water slid past in dark ribbons under the moonlight. He set the box down and placed the necklace gently on the same flat rock where her clothes had once been neatly folded. The current whispered around stones and driftwood, indifferent to everything it had seen. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Daniel said softly. He stayed until the chill sank through his jacket, until the forest settled back into its usual sounds. The investigation would limp on. There would be headlines, talking heads, online arguments about what really happened on that trail. Files might be reopened, closed, and reopened again. But for Daniel, Emma's story was never just a case number or a missing person report. It was the price of ignoring the wrong kind of man for too long, and the cost for one family of refusing to stay quiet when everyone else already had. For a few weeks after Dean's death, the town tried to pretend the story was over. The official narrative settled fast: troubled local guide, escalating harassment of hikers, confrontation with law enforcement, justified shooting. The sheriff's department framed it as a clean resolution, a necessary ending to a dangerous situation. On paper, Emma's case remained open and ongoing, but in practice her name became a footnote in the incident reports about the diner shooting. People at Miller's wiped blood off the tiles, replaced the cracked window and went back to pouring coffee. Tourists kept hiking Laurel Falls, snapping photos where a 19-year-old had simply vanished from the trail. The little river kept moving. Daniel stayed until he couldn't. The first to move was the press. When audio of Dean saying, "I just helped her disappear," surfaced through an anonymous leak, reporters descended on the county, cameras flashing along the main street. They wanted the grieving brother, the heroic sheriff, the dark side of the Smokies. Harmon did interviews. Daniel refused. Every time he saw Emma's face on a TV screen between ads for new trucks and political campaigns, it felt less like justice and more like a theft. They were using his sister as a headline. Still, the leak did something he'd been unable to do alone. It pulled in the feds. The FBI opened a parallel investigation, citing interstate park jurisdiction and possible serial behavior. Agents in pressed suits suddenly walked the same trailheads where Daniel had once stood alone. They asked questions about Dean's tours, his client lists, his bank records. Rangers who'd shrugged before now leaned forward when they talked. People who had never wanted to get involved suddenly remembered threatening comments, uncomfortable encounters, weird nights out near the trailheads. It was like the whole town had been waiting for someone with a bigger badge to give them permission to tell the truth. For a while, Daniel let himself hope. He handed over everything: copies of the SIM messages, photos of the wall in Dean's trailer, the notes, the tackle box, the audio files from Emma's phone. The agents listened, scribbled, nodded, promised updates. They revisited the riverbend where the clothes and the box had been found, sent divers into deeper pools downstream, widened the search zone beyond the park boundaries. For weeks, the banks were lined with tape and markers, drone cameras buzzing overhead, survey flags fluttering in the brush. When the calls finally came, they were never the ones he truly wanted. A shoe found in a ravine, wrong size. A strand of hair on a branch, animal. Human remains in a shallow depression 40 miles away, male. Every time his phone buzzed, his stomach knotted with possibility and then dropped with the reality. Somewhere in that window, Sheriff Harmon changed too. The man who had once told Daniel to let it go was suddenly the one pushing boxes of files across his desk toward the federal agents, pointing out inconsistencies in Dean's old statements, re-examining closed reports of lost hikers, and confused tourists who had been found shaken and unwilling to give details. Harmon sat with the FBI in long closed-door meetings. When Daniel crossed paths with him on Main Street one afternoon, the sheriff looked 10 years older. "You were right about him," Harmon said quietly, no press around, no deputies to hear him. "We should have seen it sooner." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "You did see it," he said. "You just didn't want to look directly at it." Harmon didn't argue. He just nodded. "We're checking everything he ever touched now. Old tours, old complaints. There's more out there than we thought. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something." In late November, heavy rains pushed the rivers higher, ripping branches and debris off the banks. A week after the storms, a kayaker reported something snagged in a tangle of roots along a narrow channel, scraps of fabric and what looked like bone. Within hours, the area was cordoned off. The remains were partial, the clothing too degraded to recognize at a glance. The FBI asked Daniel and his parents for new DNA samples to expedite comparison. The phrase sounded clinical, almost polite. The waiting that followed did not. The timing, the location, the size of the recovered fragments, everything pointed one way. But until the lab spoke, nobody would say it out loud. Daniel spent those days in a kind of suspended fall, walking empty roads, sitting at the edge of the water until his legs went numb, feeling the weight of every hour that had passed since April. He thought of all the times he'd walked past some patch of ground or stretch of river without knowing she was there, or that she had been. When the FBI finally called, the agent's voice was even but softer than before. "The remains are a positive match to your sister," she said. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Caldwell." That was it. No dramatic pause, no cinematic swell of background noise. Just a confirmation that Emma's missing status had shifted to something else. Officially, the case transformed from a disappearance to a homicide with a named suspect, Dean Fraser, deceased. The story wrapped itself neatly on paper, tying Dean to Emma's final hours through the recordings, his trail cams, his notes, the tackle box. Federal summaries used phrases like overwhelming circumstantial evidence and behavioral pattern consistent with predatory stalking. The local DA, under pressure from the media and the Bureau, released a statement calling Emma a victim of a calculated act of violence and Dean a lone bad actor. For the town, that language was a relief. A lone bad actor was easier to swallow than the idea that multiple people had looked away for too long. A single villain made it possible to say, "We didn't know," and start hanging ribbons and flowers and long social media posts about vigilance and community. They planned a memorial service at the park amphitheater, complete with candlelight and a slideshow of Emma's smiling photos. The college she'd attended offered to plant a tree in her name. Local reporters pitched special segments on her life and the lessons learned. Through all of it, Daniel moved like a ghost. He watched his parents decide on phrases for the obituary, watched his father practice reading something at the memorial, and then break down halfway through, watched his mother fold and unfold Emma's sweater in the living room until the seams threatened to come apart again. He felt hundreds of eyes on him everywhere. The brother who wouldn't let it go, the one who broke into the trailer, the one who cornered Dean in the diner and lit the fuse. To strangers, he was a symbol. To himself, he was just a man who had answered a text with a laughing emoji when he should have picked up the phone and driven out that same night. The day they scattered a small portion of Emma's ashes in the Smokies, the sky was a clear, brittle blue. Daniel stood with his parents at an overlook, the wind carrying fine grey dust into the air. It swirled, caught the light, vanished into the landscape she had loved. His mother whispered something into the wind. His father stood silent, gripping the railing until his knuckles went white. When they were done, the ranger who'd accompanied them stepped back and gave them space. On the drive down, a sign flashed past the car. "Never hike alone, it can wait." The irony cut deep. The rest of Emma's remains were buried in a small cemetery, not far from their family home. A simple headstone, her name, the dates that never should have been so close together. People came from town, from campus, from online communities that had followed the case. They left flowers and handwritten notes and stones on the grave. They said things like, "She'll never be forgotten," and "She changed how we think about safety." It all sounded true and hollow at the same time. After the burial, when most of the visitors had left, Sheriff Harmon walked up the path in his dress uniform, hat in hand. He stopped a few feet away from Daniel. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just wanted you to know we're still going through Dean's old roots. There may be other families who never got answers. If there are, we'll find them." "You should have said that 6 months ago," Daniel replied quietly. Harmon nodded. "I know." He paused. "You did more than most people in your position could have. Don't let anyone turn that into something ugly." Daniel didn't answer. He just looked back at Emma's headstone. In the months that followed, the fever around the case cooled. The national outlets moved on to the next disaster, the next scandal, the next story that fit neatly into a 30-second package. The Smokies stayed beautiful and dangerous. Tourists kept coming. The park installed more cameras at trailheads, ran new safety campaigns, added an extra caution section to the brochure. Hike with a partner. Tell someone where you're going. If you feel like someone is following you, trust your instincts. Report it. Locals said it felt different up there now, though. Guides watched solo hikers more closely. Rangers took weird complaints more seriously. Women who'd once brushed off unsettling encounters spoke up sooner. Nobody wanted another Emma. For Daniel, the closest thing to peace came not in the big gestures, but in the small routines. He moved back to a city a few hours away, took a job that let him keep nights free. He ran early in the mornings, the way he used to before deployments, feet hitting pavement in a steady rhythm that quieted the noise in his head. On weekends, he drove out to less crowded trails, not to punish himself by retracing Emma's route, but to remember that the wilderness had been a place she loved, not just where she disappeared. He made a choice not to let Dean own that landscape forever. Every few weeks, he visited her grave. He didn't bring flowers. She'd always hated how fast they wilted in vases. Instead, he brought stories. A weird customer from work. Something their dad said that she would have teased him about. A photo of a dog he'd seen wearing a ridiculous sweater. He'd stand there, hands in his pockets, and talk to the stone like she was just sitting across from him, rolling her eyes. Sometimes he played the audio from her phone again, not the last message, but an older one he'd saved from months before the hike. Her laughing at something stupid he'd said, telling him he was being dramatic as hell and to chill, soldier. It was the sound of her unafraid. One afternoon, as winter gave way to a hesitant spring, he drove back to the Smokies alone. The park was quieter, the air cool but not harsh. He parked at a different trailhead this time, one with an easy walk and a wide view at the top. As he started up the path, a ranger at the entrance stopped him, recognizing his face from months of news. "You heading out solo?" the ranger asked. Daniel nodded. The ranger hesitated. "You got someone who knows your route?" Daniel smiled faintly, appreciating the question, the change behind it. "Yeah," he said, "my mom. She made me text her the map." The ranger nodded. "Good, just be careful out there." "I will," Daniel replied. He hiked in silence, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the low hum of water moving over stone. At the overlook, he sat on a flat rock and looked out over the layered ridges. The mountains didn't care about his grief. They didn't care about Emma or Dean or Sheriff Harmon or the cameras or the headlines. They were older than all of it. The thought was oddly comforting. He pulled Emma's necklace from his pocket, the chain he'd taken from Dean's trailer, cleaned and repaired. He'd meant to leave it at the river forever, but after the funeral he'd gone back and picked it up, unable to walk away from that last tangible piece of her. Now he held it up to the light. The pendant flashed once, catching the sun. He slipped it back into his pocket. "You love this place," he said quietly, more to himself than to the air. "I won't let it just be where he took you from us." As he sat there, he thought about all the little decisions that had led them to this moment. The text he'd laughed off, the ranger who hadn't pushed harder, the sheriff who had chosen politics over instinct, the waitress who kept quiet because she had kids, the guide who'd watched too many women walk past him on the trail and decided that meant something he was owed. None of those things alone had killed his sister. But together, they'd built a path straight to that flat rock on the riverbank. Emma's story, he realized, was not just about a man like Dean. It was about every time someone treated fear like an overreaction. Every time a complaint got filed under "nothing to see here." It was about how easy it is to disappear if nobody believes you when you say, "Something's wrong." As the sun slid lower, Daniel stood. He took one last look at the view and then started back down the trail, step after steady step, breathing in the sharp, clean mountain air. The case files would sit in drawers. The official reports would gather dust. New hikers would come, and someday there would be people walking this trail who had never heard the name Emma Caldwell. That was the way of things. But as long as her story lived in the choices people made, in the ranger who asked one extra question, the friend who believed the uneasy text, the brother who didn't shrug off a bad feeling, that was another kind of justice. Not the kind that made headlines, not the kind that ended in a courtroom, but the kind that kept someone else from becoming a cautionary tale. Down at the trailhead, a young woman hesitated by the map board, phone in hand, scanning the route. She looked up as Daniel approached. "Hey," she said, a little nervous laugh in her voice. "Do you know if this loop is okay to do solo?" Daniel glanced at the map, then back at her. For a split second, Emma's face flickered in his mind. Earbuds, backpack, that same determined tilt to her chin. "Yeah," he said. "It's not bad, but text someone your route. And if you see anybody that makes your gut twist, you turn around, okay? No hike's worth pushing through that." She nodded slowly. Yeah, that makes sense, thanks." She started up the trail, glancing at her phone, already typing a message to someone. Daniel watched her go, then turned toward his truck. The river kept moving. The mountains watched. Somewhere between the rock where her clothes had been folded and the grave with her name on it, Emma's story stopped being just about the way she vanished and became about the way people chose to listen afterward. She couldn't come back. Nothing could fix that. But in the quiet, in the changed routines, in the new warnings and the questions and the way strangers looked twice now when someone said, "I don't feel safe," a different truth settled in. Emma Caldwell had walked into the woods and never walked back out. But the echo of her footsteps was still changing, where people chose to stop and turn around. And for Daniel, that was the only kind of ending that felt honest. One where the river didn't give all its secrets back, but it gave enough that silence was no longer an option.